So Don asked me last week, a lot of his clients in whatever his little platforms are called, challenges, they're asking about zone 2. And he's asking me if we can film something maybe a little similar than how we're filming right now, but we'll do it a little bit differently, is to explain it and maybe do a mini little exchange. And I'm doing this here, and I'll probably do other forms for the short form stuff that you see on Instagram, because I think what Don was asking for, which was really something that is always exciting to me, very similar than when I go to China. He asked, you can't be using big words, and the conversation was probably very funny because he's working with a lot of general population. And when I work overseas, and I always found this in China for two reasons. Number one, no one is stupid. They just might not know a lot. And that's how I would describe certain populations like that. But also, when I have to speak really, really slow so that the translator can properly translate, I also have to use words that fit that type of exchange. And I always would come back from China or even other places with Canada basketball, where I'd be speaking Spanish the whole time to other people, obviously not our team. It really helps me try to describe things in certain ways that make things easier. That's a compliment I really, really enjoy hearing, and it's one that we got a little bit from Perform Better in Orlando. Was Charlie, you make things really complicated or dense topics sound really, really easy. And I'm really, if that's true, that's for someone else to say and someone else to decide, but I'm really digging into the same different ways that you would try to connect with someone socially, or even how you would coach someone, where you're looking for the response is like, I don't know how in the world you just came up with that, but I know exactly what you want me to do. So let's talk about this zone 2 piece. And we're going to start in a way that we had to bring in with Don's folks, because the bottom line is, if you're not going to use scientific terms or things that are exclusive and then unfortunately potentially threatening, we have to talk about lactate. Because the bottom line is that when you look at zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, as described by San Milan, when I'll get to that too very quickly, these are just the amount of lactate that you are accumulating over any given period of time. So if you exceed a certain amount of lactate that has to be measured through the blood, then you move on to the next stage. And with each stage, with each zone, there's a different degree of adaptation that you should expect. So they're all useful. They're all good. That's in my interpretation. That's why there's 5 zones. I have made posts in the past, and I still feel that way. I don't use these terms to blindly describe, because number one, it's exclusive. It's exclusive. We kind of know that zone 2 is different than zone 3, but zone 3 isn't necessarily better than zone 2. Nominal data. So these are nominal, where you're using numbers, but it doesn't mean there's 3 of something, and it doesn't even mean that 3 is better than 2. So you're just using words, and if you don't know what the words mean, you're kind of in debt to learn them. Now, is there a better way to do that? I don't know. I'm just gonna, these things have traction. But part of the confusion to begin with is that if you look up zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you should first make sure you even know what you're looking at, because in the cycling culture and literature, those are zones that are specifically based off of heart rate. That's not the same system of zones that San Milan has discussed through his literature. So those are actually 2 different things. Now, they're not completely wildly different, where one is in Alaska and the other one's in South Florida. That's not the difference. But when we look at things, we usually describe different types of conditioning through intensities and or heart rate. And we can describe a heart rate as a function of intensity. You're going to work harder and achieve a higher heart rate. And then a cascade of things happen that you pay for and that you receive. And that's the basis of a lot of this. So the normal amount of lactate to stay within zone 2 and below, probably 1.7 to 1.9 millimoles of lactate when you measure. It has to be measured through blood. We've seen in more competitive settings, when someone's doing some type of bike test, you would then prick their ear. I think there are things that look like CGMs. They're not measuring glucose, but they can measure lactate. But they're still around like $20+ a usage. So it's much more expensive than some of the other models that would measure other valuable markers. So you would still then find, okay, how do I feel during this 2.2 or under, maybe a little closer to 2 millimoles? How do I feel? What is my heart rate here? If I'm at 3, what is my heart rate? So you can kind of extrapolate heart rates, but you're still just guessing. And I think that's important to understand, that when you look at the zones, and if someone is suggesting heart rate, number one, make sure you know what you're looking at. Number two, if you are in San Milan's categories where there are expected different types of returns on the different types of zones, remember the heart rate may not always be the same. And we'll get to that after we give this, hopefully, example to explain, now I kind of get it. Hopefully that's the goal that I can achieve here for you. Now, also something else to consider with the zones is, again, in most situations, you are in zone 2 when you can continually have a conversation. You may create an awareness that you are a little bit gassed, but you can probably still have a very professional and or business conversation. You might not be having to take a significant pause. Maybe that's not zone 2 anymore. Now you're into zone 3, which isn't a bad thing. That's kind of this thing but the talk test is something we've used quite a bit in all different markers of conditioning. So I think the talk test, can you talk and have what you would consider a professional business conversation if you had just gotten there late to the meeting and you sat down and you fixed your tie and nobody was really offended because you weren't that late, you just weren't super early. That's really the extrapolation that I would suggest to use more than heart rate. Now here's why, okay? In that conversation, Don read a tweet from an allegedly reputable source. I insisted that he not tell me who it was, which is good. So it was, you should be, and this I don't really remember, but it would be anywhere from 60 to 80% of your conditioning week should be at these lower heart rates. Then maybe 10 to 20% or less would be in these more extensive rates, but still like 80%. And then under 10% would be in these very, very high markers. Now, in order to train VO2 max, which would be very much over in zone 5, then you have to be in these higher heart rates. So to suggest that all individuals should apply that partition, how you parse out your minutes that way, I don't think that's going to always be applicable. But I certainly would say that if you put those parameters into a bag, and in another bag you pull out a random person, and then you pull out those parameters, they are going to work very, very well. I said this is not offensive. This is not making me vomit. I just think anytime you make a flat blanket statement, you're going to miss some things. And that's probably okay, but it's also okay to talk about them. So if somebody is really, really very, very fit and they're looking to push their top end, I don't know that those percentages are going to be the same. The percentages on the lower zones are going to support that finished product of high VO2, which we know is a significant marker for all-cause mortality. We also know that lots of really great repeat sprint athletes don't have this huge of a VO2. They're good at other things. That doesn't mean they're going to die. It just means that VO2 is what it is in terms of a marker. And in order to improve it, you need a lot of the things that boost underneath it, the components, the hardware, maybe the raw materials. But if you don't put yourself right at that edge of the maximal amount of oxygen you can consume, well, then you're not going to push those numbers higher. So to suggest that you should have only this small percentage, maybe for someone else. And I bet the person that wrote the tweet would agree with that. And they're just trying to throw a paintball right to the middle and see as much as it can splatter. Now, here's something else that I think is a little bit more critical. Your zones, when you talk about zone 2, zone 3, whatever it is, you are likely doing some type of conditioning that is some type of cyclic repeat. However, there is no suggestion in that tweet that you are doing an explosive cyclic repeat, which will likely keep your heart rate in the zone, in the percentages that tweet was talking about, 70%, 80%, 60%. You can average out your work and rest and stay in the same zones that if you did something very, very continuous. So an explosive cyclic repeat will have a very shorter work period and a very long rest period. We've talked about this a lot on EPP. If this makes sense to call it anti-glycolytic training, then that's exactly what it is. It's just different words. EPP is my commercial way of describing this type of training that I learned through understanding Omega Wave and through what Val Nasedikian taught me. And then you start to see it in lots of other places because, Eastern Bloc, old Soviet training would have significant value, but also to today, it's still being researched. And the big name you'd probably want to see and then look at the bibliography would be Selyunov. If you were to then suggest that you would maybe do 10 kettlebell swings, which might take you 12 seconds, and then rest for 48 seconds, you probably will average out your work, because you're only doing something for 10 seconds, your heart rate doesn't get that high, even with cardiac drift, if that's a real thing, after 20, 25 minutes of 10 kettlebell swings and resting to the remainder of the minute. By the way, you would use the talk test to start your subsequent set of next 10 swings. So if you average that out, and then as you're resting, you get this very, very high peak, but it might not even get above 140 because you're only doing something for relative 10 seconds. And then you average it out, so it's always going to be lower than this. So now you're in the 120s, but that's not zone 2 anymore because the explosive nature of doing kettlebell swings or any type of explosive cyclic repeat for the goal of developing peripheral mitochondria, well, mitochondria is pretty much always going to be peripheral, but creating mitochondria in a working system that would have relevance to your next activity, such as a sport or other types of competitive lifts. So you can't just say you need to be 60, 70%. And this was all just communication. And after Don told me who the tweet was, it made a little bit more sense, but it doesn't matter who, don't ask, because it doesn't matter. But now when you see something like that, remember how you achieve your heart rate matters. Whether you're doing something consistently in a cyclic repeat or an explosive cyclic repeat, the average might be the same, but you are building up significant amounts of lactate, and this no longer applies. Maybe San Milan would even say that. I've never heard them say that because I actually don't listen to a lot of these zone 2 conversations. Train here, get this, I get it. But well, what if I trained for this heart rate percentage of my max, but I did it during this strategy, meaning I sprinted and then I rested. I sprinted and then I rested. You have to build up way more lactate in that situation than if you stayed at that heart rate. Now, here's maybe we try to, how do you actually understand? That's more for us. We didn't get into that stuff with Don, but now here's the stuff that I'm a little excited about, and here's where the feedback can come. What I would like you to consider is the how do you appreciate these zones and which one should you be in is about buying a house, okay? So the adaptations that you get from each of the zone is the type of house you get. Zone 1 is a lesser expensive house and you get a decent place in a decent neighborhood. Zone 2, a little bit more expensive, but very, very efficient. The bills are great. It's looking to the one direction, so you get the ambient heat. All of these things keep the price very, very good for what you get. It then becomes more expensive, but you get a bigger house. Maybe you get a nice pool. Maybe it's a nicer neighborhood, or you're living in the middle of the city where when you work, you can make a lot more money. So all of the zones would be an analogy for a nicer, more expensive house. You pay what you get and you get the house. That will happen. It's not necessarily about working hard and good things happen. Of course, that's nonsense. But from this initial exchange, your hard work, this training session over weeks, gets you that house. That's how you should start to think about it. However, with the house, there's a couple other factors that you have to pay for. And how you pay for the initial cost of the house is your debt is what you have to recover from. So there isn't a significant amount of recovery from what you see in the lower zones because you're not paying a lot. But in the upper zones, you have to recover more. So now there's 3 components. It's the house you get, it's the price you pay, and now you have less money, so you have to recover. So it's like this. If I was going to flip the camera around and put it on the board, you have the house, that's your adaptations. You have the price, that's the work that you have to do to achieve that. But then you have to recover, and that's part of every training process. Now, with the type of work that you're doing, and you build up more lactate, and as you time out, and you can no longer continually use the lactate that you're generating because you're no longer able to stay in these primarily aerobic, lower cost energy systems, that's another price that you pay that then changes the type of recovery that you're going to do. And what is the analogy for that? That's all the costs of the house. That's your utilities, your internet, the HOA, the pool guy, etc., the cleaning lady. All of those costs you can imagine are going to be very, very different along the different zones. So that's how you can start to appreciate. Do you want that big bad house? Well, it's going to cost more, and the upkeep of that house is going to be more because you're generating more lactate, and lactate, let's just say, has a cost if you're not going to continually use it, number one, and because of its association with acidity, hydrogen ions. It's not lactic acid. You can measure lactic acid. It's not really what's happening. We're saying that typically with this spike in lactate, which is a very normal response as a byproduct from some of these activities, it is also associated with a preponderance of hydrogen ions that creates this acidotic environment that then kind of creates a whole bunch of other stuff. So the more lactate that you're generating because it's zone 5, the cost of the house are higher. And Don was like, wow, I've never heard anybody describe it that way. That just makes it easy to understand, okay? Again, the house is the zone. Zone 1 is a tiny little house that does what you want it to do. It delivers. It's not a piece of junk. It's just inexpensive. Zone 5 is very, very expensive. It's in Malibu, okay? Now, the work that you have to do to achieve those adaptations, that's your effort, that's your intervals, whatever it is that you're going to describe it as. That's the price that you have to pay. And then that price isn't just done. The more fit you are, the less you have to recover. The less fit you are, the more you have to recover until you do it again and buy those adaptations again. Also appreciate, though, that the difference between the zones is how much lactate you're building and how you can tolerate that and continue to go. Those are the costs of the house. So the bigger the house may have more costs involved. It costs more to air condition a big house. Now, the curveball in this piece, though, is when you're only using heart rate, which is why I said before, I kind of try to tie this back, why I wouldn't use heart rate alone. If you are less than high levels of fitness, I don't want to say you're a fat mess. I'm just saying you're less fit than somebody else. Your heart rate will be higher just because your resting heart rate is probably higher and your tolerance to using lower cost systems is less than someone else. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. You might actually be able to squat 1,200 pounds, but you're going to get into zone 3, 4, and 5 faster just based on who you are and what you're good at. That person probably would have to work less hard to stay in zone 1 and zone 2. So using heart rate alone, just like any one marker alone, or making a blanket approach to how you can categorize different things, it's not so much that it's wrong, but it's not necessarily complete. So again, if you're less fit, you're on a different purchasing scale. If you don't have a lot of money, or you need to take a mortgage, you can then get maybe a higher level house, but you have to then recover more, because now it's not just the recovery of your cost, it's the recovery of your debt of the mortgage. And maybe there's a more fun way to describe this with pictures and graphics, but that's where we would look at zones and appreciate them as houses, and then all of the different costs and recovery of those costs to understand the differences. And those costs, that's lactate. We have to be able to say that, and we have to appreciate that it's not a very simple thing. It's a simple thing to measure. It's not necessarily an easy thing to measure. So we're looking for these extrapolations. I'd like to use the talk test much, much cleaner, much, much quicker than using heart rate to appreciate the different zones.